Dread Horror. Uncover the darkest mysteries that remain unsolved. If you dare, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying story. Saturday morning, bright and early, I wandered through the rows of old furniture, dusty books, and forgotten trinkets at a local yard sale. There was something almost magical about finding treasures among discarded items. Stories locked in objects waiting for a new owner. I had no idea that one purchase would bring me closer to a nightmare I could never have imagined. It was an old wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, with intricate carvings of strange symbols I couldn't recognize. The woman selling it, an elderly lady with sunken eyes, stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "That box," she murmured, "has a history. Some things should be left alone." I should have walked away. Instead, curiosity got the better of me. $20, I said, pretending not to be affected by her warning. She hesitated before taking my money, her fingers trembling as she handed me the box. "Do not open it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And whatever you do, don't feed it." I laughed nervously, assuming it was some eccentric old woman nonsense. I took the box home, eager to inspect my find. That night, I placed the box on my coffee table and examined it more closely. There was no latch or keyhole, yet the lid remained firmly shut. My fingers traced the strange carvings. Some looked like twisted faces, others like tangled vines choking the surface. I felt an odd warmth seeping from the wood, as if it were alive. Ignoring the unease creeping up my spine, I set it aside and went to bed. At exactly 3:13 a.m., I woke up to a scratching sound. It was faint at first, like a mouse skittering across the floor. Then it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the box. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. My logical brain told me it was just settling wood or my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard something else, a whisper. Low and guttural, it slithered through the darkness. "Let me out." I bolted from my bed and turned on every light in the house. The box sat on my coffee table, unmoving, silent. I almost convinced myself I had dreamed it, until I saw the deep claw marks gouged into the wood floor beneath it. By the next evening, I was convinced I had to get rid of the box. I drove to the outskirts of town and tossed it into a river. I watched as it bobbed for a moment before sinking beneath the surface. Relieved, I returned home, took a long shower, and went to bed early. At exactly 3:13 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something dripping. The air smelled like damp wood and rot. My breath hitched in my throat as I turned toward my nightstand. The box was there, wet, dripping, and this time it was open. I barely had time to react before the whisper returned. Now a chorus of voices, some pleading, some laughing, others sobbing. The air grew thick with the scent of decay. Shadows twisted unnaturally in the corners of my room. Then something cold wrapped around my wrist. I screamed. From that night on, my life spiraled into chaos. Objects moved on their own. My reflection in the mirror would sometimes smile when I wasn't. Whispers followed me wherever I went, growing louder when I tried to sleep. Desperate, I returned to the yard sale house, but it was abandoned. Windows shattered, door swinging open. The whole place reeked of something dead. Neighbors claimed the old woman had passed away years ago. That was impossible. I had just bought the box from her days ago. Or had I? I spent hours researching the symbols on the box. Ancient, forbidden, a vessel for something that should never be released. It was no longer a question of getting rid of it. It was a question of surviving it. At 3:13 a.m., the box opened on its own. A thick, black mist slithered out, twisting into shapes that should not exist. Eyes blinked open within the darkness. Too many eyes. And the whispers turned into laughter. Mocking. Hungry. Something crawled out. The last thing I remember was the feeling of cold hands dragging me into the abyss. The echoes of my own screams lost in the void. A week later, my apartment was found empty. My phone, keys, and wallet were untouched. The only thing left behind was an old wooden box, closed once more, and it was waiting for the next owner. I have always loved yard sales. There's something about sifting through other people's discarded belongings that makes me feel like a treasure hunter. You never know what you'll find. Sometimes it's junk, sometimes it's gold, and sometimes it's something that should have stayed buried. It started with a painting. I found it at an old woman's estate sale, buried beneath a pile of cracked picture frames. The moment I laid eyes on it, I felt a strange pull. It was a portrait of a little girl, no older than 7, wearing a faded blue dress. Her hair was auburn, neatly curled, and her eyes were what unsettled me the most. They were a deep, unnatural black, as if the artist had dipped the brush in pure void. Despite the eerie sensation that crept over me, I bought it. I should have left it there. I hung the painting in my living room, admiring the way it added an antique charm to the space. But as night fell, unease settled in. Every time I glanced at the portrait, I swore the little girl's expression had changed. Her lips, once neutral, now seemed to hint at a smirk. Her eyes, those black, bottomless pits, felt like they were following me. At 3:33 a.m., I woke up to a faint whisper. It was distant, almost like a breath against my ear. I froze, my pulse hammering in my throat. The house was silent, but something felt wrong. My gaze drifted toward the living room. The painting had fallen from the wall. Convinced it was nothing more than a loose nail, I rehung the portrait. But the feeling of being watched grew worse. Shadows seemed to shift around the painting, stretching unnaturally when I wasn't looking. That night, the whispering returned, closer this time, urgent. "Let me out." I shot up in bed, sweat dripping down my neck. The air was thick, suffocating. My instincts screamed at me to get rid of the painting, but some unseen force kept me rooted in place, unable to act. And then the nightmares started. In my dreams, the girl from the painting stood at the foot of my bed, staring with those hollow black eyes. Her lips would part, revealing teeth far too sharp for a child. She whispered things I couldn't understand, her voice layered with something ancient, something wrong. And every time I woke up, the painting seemed closer. On the 4th night, I locked it in the basement, shoving it beneath an old sheet. I told myself it was over. It wasn't. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the whispers returned, this time echoing from beneath the floorboards. "Let me out." The air grew cold, the scent of mildew and decay filling my nostrils. My body trembled as I crept toward the basement door. My hands shook as I turned the knob. The painting was no longer under the sheet. It was hanging on the wall. Desperate, I did what I should have done from the beginning. I researched the portrait. My search led me to a decades-old newspaper article about a girl named Eleanor Carter, who had vanished in 1956. Her parents had commissioned a portrait of her just before she disappeared. The painter, a man named Victor Grayson, was found dead days later, his body twisted and mutilated in his studio. The portrait was the last thing he worked on. His final words, scrawled in blood on the wall, "Do not look into her eyes." Panic gripped me. I had spent nights staring into those eyes. I had invited her into my home. I needed to destroy it. I grabbed a can of gasoline and doused the portrait in my backyard. My hands fumbled with the lighter, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As the flames consumed the painting, the whispers turned into screams, high-pitched, agonized wails that pierced the night air. Shadows coiled and twisted in the fire, forming the outline of a little girl. Her mouth stretched open in a silent shriek, her black eyes locking onto mine one last time. Then she was gone, or so I thought. It's been 3 months since I burned the painting, but I still wake up at 3:33 a.m. The whispers have returned, and last night when I looked in the mirror, my reflection didn't move. I've always had a soft spot for antiques. There's something fascinating about old objects, how they hold pieces of history, silent witnesses to the lives that owned them before. That's why, When I spotted an old marionette at a neighborhood yard sale, I couldn't resist. It was exquisite, hand-carved, dressed in tattered Victorian-style clothing. Its wooden face was painted with delicate, lifelike features, but something about its glass eyes unsettled me. They were too real, too knowing. The seller, an elderly man with sunken cheeks and yellowed fingernails, seemed almost relieved when I picked it up. $5, he rasped, hurriedly wrapping the puppet in an old cloth. Take it, and don't leave it in your bedroom. I laughed, assuming it was just an old superstition. I should have listened. Back home, I placed the marionette on a shelf in my living room. As I studied it under the dim light, unease crept over me. The craftsmanship was unervingly detailed. Tiny wrinkles around its eyes, faint cracks on its lips, almost like aging skin. That night, I woke to a faint tapping sound. I turned on the bedside lamp, my heart pounding. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I sighed, blaming my overactive imagination, and rolled over. Then I noticed my bedroom door. It was open. I distinctly remembered closing it before bed. Swallowing my nerves, I got up and checked the house. Everything was in place except for one thing. The marionette was no longer on the shelf. I found it sitting on the couch, its limbs twisted at odd angles. Its head was slightly tilted, as if watching me. I convinced myself I had moved it and forgotten. That was the only logical explanation, right? The next morning, I placed the marionette back on the shelf and left for work. But all day, an eerie sensation followed me, like unseen eyes boring into my back. That night, the tapping returned. Louder, rhythmic. It sounded like tiny feet scurrying across the wooden floor. I sat up, my throat dry. The room was pitch dark except for the faint glow of my alarm clock. 3:12 a.m. The tapping stopped abruptly. Then my bedsheets shifted. A weight pressed down on my legs, small, bony fingers crawling up toward my chest. I screamed and flung my arm out, hitting nothing but air. Scrambling for the light, I gasped when the room flooded with brightness. The marionette was on my bed. Its head was an inch from my face, and its mouth was open. I should have gotten rid of it, but something stopped me, some irrational compulsion, like an invisible thread tying me to it. Instead, I locked it in my closet. That was a mistake. At exactly 3:12 a.m., I woke to a scratching sound. Slow, deliberate. It was coming from inside the closet. I held my breath as the door creaked open on its own. Darkness spilled into the room, swallowing the weak glow of my bedside lamp. And then, a voice. A whisper. I want to play. The marionette was standing upright, its strings dangling from nothing. I ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped toward the nearest bridge. My only thought was to get rid of it, throw it into the water, let it sink into oblivion. But when I reached for the puppet, the seat beside me was empty. I nearly veered off the road. I felt it before I saw it. A small, cold hand curling around my ankle. I don't remember how I got home. My memories are a blur of terror and exhaustion. But I knew one thing, I had to burn it. With trembling hands, I built a fire in my backyard. I threw the marionette into the flames, watching as the wood blackened, its painted face cracking. I screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that rang through the night, making my skin crawl. Shadows danced violently around the fire, twisting into monstrous shapes. And then silence. The marionette was gone. Ashes scattered in the wind. It's been weeks since that night. I tell myself it's over. But sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I hear it. A faint tapping. A whisper in the darkness. I want to play. I never believed in curses. Ghost stories were just that, stories. But the day I bought the old wooden box at a yard sale was the day I learned that some objects carry something far worse than just history. It was an ordinary Saturday morning, and I was out hunting for antiques when I stumbled upon a small, run-down house on the edge of town. The woman running the sale was pale, gaunt, and had dark circles under her eyes. She barely spoke, only watching with tired, sunken eyes as people picked through her belongings. That's when I saw it. A small, intricately carved wooden box sat on a table among piles of old books and dusty porcelain dolls. It had delicate engravings of unfamiliar symbols along its surface, and despite its age, the wood felt unnaturally smooth. I picked it up, feeling an odd warmth radiate from it. "How much for this?" I asked. The woman stiffened. "You don't want that." Her voice was hoarse, almost fearful. I gave her a questioning look. "Why not?" She hesitated, her lips trembling as if she was deciding whether or not to speak. Then, in a low whisper, she said, "It keeps things." I let out a nervous chuckle. "Keeps things? Like a jewelry box?" "No." Her voice dropped even lower. "It keeps voices." I should have walked away. I should have listened to the sheer terror in her voice. But instead, I laughed it off and handed her a $20 bill. She flinched when my fingers brushed hers, then quickly shoved the money into her pocket and turned away, as if she couldn't bear to see me take it. That was my second warning. I ignored it too. Back home, I placed the box on my coffee table, admiring its craftsmanship. There was no visible latch or hinge, yet something told me it was meant to open. I ran my fingers over the engravings, feeling a strange pulse beneath the wood, like a faint heartbeat. Then I heard it, a whisper. I snapped my head around. My apartment was empty. The TV was off. My phone was on silent. Another whisper, this time clearer. It was coming from the box. I held my breath and leaned in. The sound was faint, like someone speaking just beyond a thick wall. "Hello," I whispered back, feeling ridiculous. Silence. Then, just as I was about to pull away, a voice rasped from within the box. Soft, fragile, yet unmistakably real. "Let me out." I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. My pulse thundered in my ears. The voice had been clear, desperate. My mind raced through rational explanations. Was it some kind of old recording mechanism? A trick of the wind? My own imagination? I should have thrown it away right then. But I didn't. By the third night, the whispers had multiplied. At first, it was just the single voice pleading. Then others joined. Some were sobbing. Others muttered in languages I didn't recognize. And one, a deep, guttural growl, spoke words that made my skin crawl. "Let us in." I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I dreamt of the box, of hands clawing at the lid from the inside, of eyeless faces pressed against its wooden walls, of a chorus of voices screaming in unison. And then, I made the worst mistake of all. I opened it. The box had no visible seam, yet as soon as my fingers pried at its edges, the wood parted effortlessly, as if it had been waiting. The whispers stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, a gust of freezing air burst from within, knocking me onto my back. My lights flickered violently, and the room seemed to stretch, the walls bending like melted wax. A shadow bled out from the box, dark and formless, rising from the open cavity like smoke. And then the voices returned, no longer whispers, but shrieks. Shapes twisted within the shadows, elongated limbs, faces contorted in agony. They poured from the box like a tidal wave, filling my apartment with darkness, slithering into corners, slipping into mirrors, pressing against my skin like invisible fingers. Then the growling voice spoke, louder than ever. "You opened the door. Now we walk free." I don't remember how I got out of my apartment. I just remember running barefoot, heart pounding, lungs burning. I drove through the night, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to believe it was over, but deep down I knew better. When I checked into a motel miles away, I convinced myself I was safe. Just as I started to relax, my phone buzzed. A voicemail. With trembling hands, I pressed play. First, all I heard was static. Then, through the crackling distortion, a whisper slithered through. "You brought us with you. It's been weeks." The whispers haven't stopped. They follow me everywhere, whispering through vents, echoing through phone calls, rising from the darkness beneath my bed. I've tried everything. burning the box, burying it, even tossing it into the ocean. Nothing works. The voices are always there, and I know now, they always will be. It was an unassuming Saturday morning when Alex decided to stop by a local yard sale. He had nothing particular in mind, just browsing through second-hand items, searching for a vintage lamp or perhaps an interesting book. The sale was small, just a handful of tables set up along the side of an old, run-down house at the edge of town. The house itself had a strange air about it, as if it had witnessed too many years of forgotten history. The woman running the sale, Mrs. Carmichael, was elderly, with thin white hair tied back in a tight bun and a stiff, stoic expression that didn't seem to match her surroundings. She didn't smile, but she didn't scowl either. It was as if she was merely going through the motions of an activity she had done for decades. The tables were covered with mismatched dishes, old furniture, and boxes of forgotten trinkets. But there was one item that caught Alex's eye immediately: a large, ornate wooden box. The box was positioned near the back of the table, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle from which Alex looked at it. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but there was something unnerving about the patterns, an almost hypnotic quality. It wasn't the kind of box you'd expect to find at a yard sale, not with its polished finish and heavy, intricate locks. "Interesting piece," Alex said, picking it up. "How much is this?" Mrs. Carmichael turned to him, her expression unreadable. "That one's not for sale," she replied, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Not to anyone who isn't meant to have it." Alex chuckled nervously, unsure whether the woman was just trying to be dramatic or if she was truly serious. He took a step back, glancing at her, then at the box again. There was something about the way it gleamed in the sunlight that seemed to draw him closer. "I'll take it," Alex said impulsively. "How much?" There was a brief moment of silence before Mrs. Carmichael nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing. $20, she said in a soft, almost reluctant voice. Alex agreed, paid her, and walked away with the box tucked under his arm, the strange sense of unease still lingering at the back of his mind. It wasn't until he got home and placed the box on his desk that the real oddities began. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just an old wooden box, like any other. Alex ran his fingers over the carvings, tracing their shapes, but each time his hand touched the box, the air around him seemed to grow colder, heavier. Later that night, as he was watching TV in his living room, Alex heard faint whispers. At first, he thought it was just the wind, or perhaps the hum of an old appliance. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more distinct, and Alex realized that the source was coming from the box. His heart skipped a beat. He froze, staring at the box, which now sat motionless on his desk. The whispers turned to words. "Let me out! Let me out!" A cold shiver ran down his spine. Alex didn't want to touch it. He didn't want to open it, but curiosity gnawed at him. Slowly, he reached for the box, lifting it from his desk. The whispers became louder, more frantic. The words were no longer pleading, they were demanding. "Open it! Open it now!" He hesitated for a moment before reluctantly undoing the latch. The moment the box opened, a gust of wind seemed to blow through the room, and the whispers grew into frantic voices, all speaking at once, their words incomprehensible. He slammed the box shut, his hands trembling. For a moment, everything went still. The house was silent again, the eerie whispers replaced by the soft hum of the streetlights outside. But something was different. Alex felt watched, as though someone or something was observing him from the darkness of his apartment. He tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, heavy in the air. The next few days were a blur of strange occurrences. Objects in his apartment began to shift slightly from their usual places. His keys would disappear, only to reappear hours later in locations he was sure he hadn't left them. At night, he would hear footsteps in the hallway outside his door, even though he lived alone. It was during one of these nights, around 2 a.m., that Alex felt the compulsion to open the box again. He tried to resist, but the voices were louder now, calling to him from within the box. The air around him grew cold as he lifted the box and slowly pried it open. This time, instead of whispers, a guttural growl escaped from within. A shadow moved inside, swirling like smoke. Before he could react, a hand shot out of the box, cold and skeletal, grabbing his wrist with a grip that felt like ice. He screamed, struggling to pull away, but the hand tightened its hold, pulling him toward the box. His vision began to blur, the room spinning as he was yanked closer and closer to the dark abyss inside. In a panic, Alex threw the box across the room. The moment it hit the floor, the force of the impact caused it to snap shut, and the shadow retreated back into the box. The room fell silent. For a moment, Alex stood there, gasping for breath, his body shaking uncontrollably. He dared not approach the box, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from it. Something had been released, a presence that was now lingering in the air, watching, waiting. The next day, Alex went to Mrs. Carmichael's house, hoping to return the box, but she was nowhere to be found. The house appeared abandoned, windows boarded up and the yard empty. The yard sale had vanished as though it had never existed. A cold chill ran down his spine. The box was no longer just an item, it had become a curse. And now it was his responsibility to find a way to rid himself of it before it claimed him entirely. That night, as he sat in his living room, the whispers started again, louder than ever. They were no longer coming from the box. They were coming from everywhere. "Let me out! Let me out!" As the days passed, Alex's behavior grew increasingly erratic. His friends noticed his eyes, hollow, bloodshot, as though he hadn't slept in days. He spoke in strange, broken sentences, and sometimes he would simply sit in his apartment, staring at the box, his mind lost in whatever dark void it had opened. It wasn't long before the whispers took form. At night, the shadowy figure from the box appeared in the corners of his room, its elongated limbs stretching out, moving closer and closer, always watching. And then one day, Alex vanished. He was never seen again. The box was found on his desk, unopened, its strange carvings now glowing faintly, as if alive. No one ever dared touch it again. It remained there, a reminder of the price one pays for curiosity, of the horrors that linger just beyond the edge of the known world. And so the box waits, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul, its whispers calling out from the shadows.